All right, a few quick thoughts. I just finished today this new Alan Moore novel, The Great When, and I've reviewed a lot of Alan Moore books on my channel and read him for a long time. So it was kind of, I have to say, I was not, I had low expectations for this book, and I was pleasantly surprised. I enjoyed this book more than I had expected, especially based on his last two prose books, Jerusalem, which I did a review. I did a review of Jerusalem when it came out, and I liked some parts of it, but there was also a lot of negative things in it that I didn't care for. I found the writing a bit clunky. And then Illuminations, his short story collection, which was kind of mixed bag. It was okay. It didn't seem that essential though. So I was coming to this Great When book, which is part of a 5 book series that he's working on. I guess the structure is going to be like this. And before you go any further, I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but this is pretty well known that he's going to set this at different times. I think it's this book's about 1949, then the next book's 1959, 1969, 1979, and then he jumps ahead 20 years to 1999, and those will be the 5 books about this kind of one character and a lot of other characters. So anyways, yeah, I came to this book. I read the first section, and I wasn't going to keep reading. I was actually going to jump ship and just say, like, this is not worth my time. Certainly not worth 5 books of my time. But I wasn't even going to make it through the first book. I was going to give up. But I was in Thailand when I started it, and I read the first part, not stoned, not hot, not doing any drugs or alcohol. The second, the next day though, I did weed, and I'm like, maybe I'll give it another chance. So I went back to it, and I enjoyed it much more. So I'm not saying you need weed or other drugs or alcohol to enjoy the book. I'm just saying that there are some books, I think I've referenced Naked Lunch as a book that reading it sober, it's so boring and uninteresting, but you read it when you're high and it's like amazing. So maybe this will be that kind of book for you. Anyways, let me just go back to whether you're reading this stoned or sober, whatever. It doesn't matter. I did enjoy this book more than Jerusalem, that's for sure. I think Voice of the Fire, though, his first novel, I still think is his best prose work. But I enjoyed this one. So let's take a look deeper at this. I think when I started it too, most authors and they kind of make an experience for the reader that's accessible and invites them into the book and kind of gives them a nice smooth ride. But then there's some authors that aren't like that at all. And I think with this book, initially at least, it felt like less like a smooth ride and more like, it really felt like I was in a jungle with a machete chopping through vines, and like just to go 10 feet was a lot of work. But I stuck with it and I started to get into it more. And it was also kind of, I'm looking at my notes, I have a lot of notes. It was also kind of every time I read more, which doesn't seem to be regularly, like it'll be like months or years even between his books, but I've been reading him so long that it's like I kind of know what to expect. And it also feels like though he's aware that people have been reading him a long time and he's trying to give them something new and kind of subvert their expectations about what an Alan Moore story is. And I think that's sort of a defining feature in his oeuvre. If you look at one like story that he's known for, there's going to be a totally different genre that he's worked with and totally different set of expectations and so on. So this book is essentially horror, cosmic horror, I guess, in the tradition of like Lovecraft, and maybe even more than Lovecraft, though, Arthur Machen, who is an author that Moore has been citing for over 20 years. The first time I heard him mention him was in Promethea, that comic series, which is also about magic. This whole series seems to be pretty heavily, all of his prose novels at least have been heavily concerned with magic, and this is no exception to that. So Arthur Machen wrote cosmic horror, and I haven't read enough of him, but I want to read more after reading this book and kind of reminding me that, oh yeah, he was really into Machen for a while. And as I read this book, though, The Great When, there's a lot of references to one specific story by Machen called N, which is just the initial N. And what N stands for is comes up in the book, so I won't even go into it anymore. So anyways, I do recommend reading N, Arthur Machen's short story, before you read this book, just because it's like you're going to be, otherwise you're going to want to stop and like say, what is this story that he keeps referencing? It helps. It's just go read N first. It's in a Machen collection, and you can probably find it online pretty easily. So there's also in this book, a lot of characters based on real people, like a lot of them, especially in the world of the occult and magic. So the people that I just can remember off the top of my head that were real people: Aleister Crowley, Dion Fortune, Kenneth Grant, Austin Osman Spare is a really big character. Prince Monolulu and Jack Comer. I've heard of the magic characters. The other ones, Prince Monolulu and Jack Comer, I'd never heard of. And you don't need to necessarily know who they are. But when as I started realizing that there's a lot of real people in this, I was just, it helps you if you just know who they are before you read it. So if you don't know who these people are, maybe just a quick glance at their Wikipedia page at least. I did notice also that I just downloaded this biography of Austin Osman Spare, who I was kind of familiar with, but I certainly hadn't read a biography of him. But I'm curious about him now, and I noticed that biography by Kenneth, I think the guy's name, no, Phil Baker, the introduction is actually by Alan Moore, so I'm guessing that book was a large source of Moore's kind of research into the character of Austin Osman Spare. So anyways, there's some real people that knowing that ahead of time really helps. Mixing that, the real world and the fiction world is kind of something that another author that I know Moore likes and I like, Robert Anton Wilson. And I was specifically thinking of that book, Masks of the Illuminati, which also has Aleister Crowley as a character. I'm just bringing that up because there's a lot of magic shows up a lot in this book, and I just found it. I could feel the workings behind Moore's thought process as he was creating these characters, and I've just read so many Moore books that it's interesting to see these things come into being out of his head, and the characters. I think one reason that Jerusalem didn't quite work for me is that the way that Moore was trying to make the characters was kind of still in this kind of literary fiction mold of you got to be realistic and stuff. And I think with this book, he kind of jettisons that and says nah, screw that. It's much easier to make characters memorable if you make them like cartoons. And I was thinking of P.G. Wodehouse, which he's not an author that I've read a lot of, but I read at least one of his books a long time ago. But one thing I remember about it was that the characters were very cartoon-like, and that's something that sandwiching that into Vonnegut too has that kind of those kind of characters. They just seem very idiosyncratic, and they're not necessarily people that you meet every day, but when you see them on the page, you remember them so much better. And when you kind of sandwich that into this cosmic horror vein, where horrific things are happening and horrific possibilities are being unveiled, it just creates a weird juxtaposition. But I like it because you read Lovecraft or you read Machen, and sometimes the characters and the situation are just so but when you have it in the background, it's in the background of these kind of sillier characters and sillier. There's a lot of humor in this book, definitely. I laughed at various points, and but then it's right next to these horror scenes and horrific things that are happening. So it's kind of a nice contrast. I liked it. Another kind of helpful hint, I think, to navigate this book, there's several of Austin Osman Spare's paintings are described, or his art is described, and if you don't think about it, you may not even realize that they're real paintings, but they are. So the four that are mentioned, there's this one, there's this one, there's this one, and then there's one other one that I could not find online, unfortunately. The one with the horse. If anyone knows where it's at, please let me know down below in the comments, because I'd like to see it and I couldn't find it online. I also found that there was a nice rhythm, like when this book really worked. It has a jauntiness and a rhythm to it that I think a lot of authors aren't even like aware of, like the idea that prose can have these rhythms to it. And so I think that was another thing I liked about it. And that, I don't know, it just, to me, this is the first time in a long time that I've read a novel that I was like, it was like a page turner, and I really wanted to know how it ended, and I wanted to keep going. And there were a few times, especially near the end, kind of the final conflict, and I won't spoil anything, but I feel like it wasn't quite as clean as some parts in the book, in terms of the mechanics of how it worked. But I still enjoyed the book, and I would consider rereading it at some point. I don't know when the second book's coming out. If it's going to be more than a few years, maybe I'll reread this. I don't know. But I wouldn't. The point is, I wouldn't mind rereading it. And the idea of rereading Jerusalem, for example, or Illuminations, doesn't interest me at all. Whereas this, like, I'm like, hey, I like the characters enough. There were a lot of great characters, and there were some characters that I feel like I didn't quite get a handle on who they were and what was going on as well as I could have. And it's not that they're poorly written or anything. I feel like that they were, this was something I see in some of my favorite novels, is that, like, when there's just so many characters or a lot going on, if you reread the book, you can understand them a little better. And, obviously, usually the author has a much better idea of what the characters are like and what's happening than the reader on the first reading. I also mentioned Promethea, the comic, which is also about magic and fiction and the imagination a lot. I think in some ways, though, by working in prose, you're not constrained by the artists that you work with. And in this case, when you enter these realms of these alternate, I won't spoil what's going to happen in the book, but there's like this alternate realm. And when you enter that, it seems like almost anything can happen. And there's like this dynamic you have to balance in fantasy, like where, you want to make it seem like anything can happen, but you don't want to make it seem like anything can happen, because then there's like no point to the story and the mechanics just fall apart, and it's like there's no rules that have any consequence. So you kind of have to find that balance. Horror as a genre is interesting. It's almost ontological in its scope, in like a religious sense of its main purpose is not to tell a good story. I mean, that's, always helpful and nice, but really horror, especially this cosmic horror of like Lovecraft and things like that, and Machen, its purpose is not to just primarily tell a story. It's to have this conversation between the author and the reader, and try to get the reader to conceive that the way that they've thought about the universe is not right at all, and like that there's dreadful things that are far, like if the author can like just nudge the reader a little towards believing that these things are possible, then they've succeeded. And plot and character and all other stuff is secondary. So at its best, I feel like that's where this book succeeds, because it does have a plot and a lot of interesting things that happen, but it's also about shifting the reader's perspective, and kind of it does it in a way by going into these really poetic, imaginative visions that are up there with like William Blake and things like that. But I was thinking about Promethea, how Promethea, it works in some ways, but it's also constrained by the vision of the artist, J.H. Williams III, the artist that he worked with there, who's a great artist, but the imagination of the reader is not going to be ever identical with an artist. So it's like words can do a lot more. Let me share a quote from the book. There's a character who talks, and this is that kind of like P.G. Wodehouse, Kurt Vonnegut type of characterization that I think, this is very different from something like, I don't know, Watchmen or whatever you've read by Moore, because, this is not realistic. Here's the quote, exactly as it's written on the page. There's this character, Coffin Ada, and she talks like this all the time. Don't cough, cough, cough. Look at me like that. With you not coming back, keeping the cough, cough bed seem cough, 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 cough. Fucking morbid. Cough, cough, cough. I wasn't totally surprised when actually P.G. Wodehouse was mentioned in the book. You may be wondering, how well do you need to know London to enjoy these books? I can say that I went to London once, I was there for 3 weeks, but it was like 20 years ago, and I don't know London super well. I know it, but I mean I'm not catching every reference, obviously. But I still feel like I enjoyed this book, and I think it's a matter of if you know London well, you're probably going to enjoy this even more because you're going to catch every little reference that I'm missing. But I didn't feel that I was losing too much of the actual story and the dynamics. So don't let that hold you back. I'm sure with Google and any other guide to London, you can navigate this book pretty well. There was a dream sequence in this book that I think was one of the most. It felt like a dream because it navigated the dynamics of how dreams work and their logic better than just about any other dream that I've seen in a movie or fiction. It felt like a dream, and then I kind of realized it was a dream. It was incredible. I thought it was one of sometimes, like I said, with Jerusalem, there's times when I feel like Moore's writing isn't quite as good in some ways, but then I read his introduction. He did an introduction to Coincidence by Robert Anton Wilson. I thought that's like one of his best recent prose in the last 10 years. So I think he still has it, and sometimes he hits it, sometimes he doesn't. But I felt like this book overall was pretty great. I enjoyed it, and some parts I could predict because I know, like I said, I know how he tries to set things up and kind of trick the reader a little. But I still enjoyed, even when I predicted things well. But I'm eager to see where this book goes. I'm curious to see how many of these characters are going to return. Where's he going to go with this? Because he's done kind of similar things with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He jumped around through the years. And Voice of the Fire, his first novel, set all in Northampton over hundreds or thousands of years. And so this is a somewhat similar format, but I want to see where he goes with this character. The main character seems kind of like he's going to maybe turn into like an Alan Moore type writer, but I really don't know. At this point he's still a young guy. He's like 19 in this book, and it could go anywhere from here. So I'm curious. I will definitely keep going with it, and it's got me curious. One final note that not really related to the story itself, but that story that is referenced a lot, N by Arthur Machen. There's something I noticed linguistically in it. There's a semantic shift. The actual phrase used in the story is he had been hallucinated, which it wasn't meaning that a character had been hallucinated by another character. The way it's talked about is to say that to be hallucinated is like something that happens to you. So I had been hallucinated, like a hallucination came and descended upon me. So I'm not sure how the semantic shift of hallucinated kind of shifted towards our modern sense, in which the person doing the hallucinating is the person. But in the past, it seems to have been like something that happened to someone rather than something they did, which I just thought was kind of neat. And related to this story, this book, which has a lot to do with things that could be hallucinations or could be not, it raises some interesting ideas. So yeah, let me know what you thought of this book. I did enjoy it. It was I'm so glad I didn't just discard it as I had originally planned, and that I persevered, because it was an enjoyable read, one of the best novels I've read in quite a while, and I will see what the other ones hold, and I hope they come out soon. So check it out. What's it called? The Great When. The Great When, part 1 of the 5-part Long London Quintet. I think they announced the second novel's title, but I don't think they've announced the release date. So hopefully not too long. So we'll see what happens.